A hush falls over the mind before it hears its own heartbeat, and in that tremor-rich silence, a question booms louder than any siren. If life is a gift, why does it feel wrapped in barbed wire? Imagine a lone traveler standing on the ridge of a blackened mountain at dawn. Every step forward slices his feet, yet the sun, indifferent and gorgeous, still crawls over the horizon. That traveler is you, is me, is every soul that ever paused long enough to notice the needles braided into the ribbon of existence. Arthur Schopenhauer did not avert his eyes from that horizon. He stared until the light burned itself into his retinas, and then wrote with unsparing clarity that the world is not a benevolent playground, but a furnace stoked by an impersonal will. He called it the endless striving of all things, a blind appetite that pushes the moth toward flame, the lover toward heartbreak, the dreamer toward dull compromise. We are marionettes yanked by threads we never chose, and the puppet master is an urge that feeds on its own frustration. Satisfaction, when it comes, is a brief anesthesia before the next contraction of wanting. And so the traveler continues, compelled to climb even as the rocks shred his palms, because the will demands ascent for the sake of ascent. We inherit a universe that drips with possibility, yet leaks meaning through its seams. A cathedral whose stained glass stories are shattered the moment we see how fragile the panes have always been. The torment lies here. We are conscious enough to witness the wound, but powerless to cauterize it. Schopenhauer's voice, gravelly with 19th century thunder, reminds us that this very consciousness is the scalpel that keeps reopening the cut. Pain is not an accident in the blueprint. Pain is the blueprint itself. The child cries when the toy breaks. The adult cries when the future breaks. And the philosopher cries because he understands that even paradise, if it could be reached, would collapse under the gravity of unquenched desire. Yet before despair swallows us whole, look closer at the crackling edges of this insight. There is a strange liberation in naming the beast. Call suffering inevitable, and the chase for perfect happiness loses its tyranny. Strip the illusion, and what remains is a raw, terrifying freedom. The capacity to sculpt dignity from unavoidable distress. The traveler bleeding on the ridge can no longer pretend the path is gentle, but he can decide how to bear the cuts, whether to curse every drop of blood or let each sting sharpen his perception of what is real. Schopenhauer challenges us not to destroy desire that war is unwinnable, but to pierce its costume, to see it dancing naked in torchlight, ridiculous and unstoppable, and then to bow with a crooked grin. This is not resignation, it is defiance against false consolation. It is refusing to be duped by the carnival barker who promises painless thrills behind the curtain. The curtain is thin. Tug it aside and you'll find mirrors, cracked and dusty, reflecting the same haunted face of longing. Accept that face and suddenly the carnival loses its power. Suffering in its inevitability becomes a teacher more honest than any bliss that can be bought or borrowed. Listen to the wind that hisses through those broken mirrors. It whispers that every pang, every restless night, is proof you are still alive enough to feel, still courageous enough not to numb yourself into marble. The torment of existence is the price of awareness, and awareness is the precondition for awe. Awe at the thunderhead rolling across a twilight field. Awe at the tremor in a lover's voice when they confess they cannot promise forever. Awe at the fragile miracle that the universe arranged carbon, water, and electrical sparks just so, and called the result your name. In this light, pain is not an error, but an emphasis red ink underlining the intensity of being here at all. You are the traveler, yes, but you are also the mountain and the sunrise and the tearing wind. And in that vast entanglement, the will's relentless pulse becomes a drum you can march to instead of chains you must drag. Step off that ridge for a moment and walk with me through a city that never sleeps, where neon arteries pulse like nervous systems exposed, where every billboard is a glowing promise that the gnawing ache inside you can be quieted if only you swipe, scroll, click, purchase, perform. The will, once hidden in metaphysics, has rented penthouse space in your pocket. It vibrates at 3 a.m. with an algorithmic whisper that someone somewhere is happier, prettier, richer, more fulfilled than you, and the rasp of comparison files your self-worth down to sparks. Schopenhauer warned that desire is a hydra sever one head and 7 more spitfire, and the digital age has stitched 1,000 new faces onto that beast. You chase notifications like droplets of morphine, each red dot a tiny assurance that you still exist in the swarm, yet the relief dissipates before your thumb lifts from the glass. How could it last? The will's hunger is structural. Satisfaction would be its suicide note. So the timeline scrolls on, and the traveler now paces a labyrinth of mirrors, each reflection a curated illusion of other people's victories. Every mirror slices you with the implication that you are unmade until you outshine the next mirage, that peace is a finish line and you are late. But listen, beneath the pandemonium, the same heartbeat still drums ancient, indifferent, unstoppable. Its tempo has not changed since the first cell twitched in primordial oceans. What has changed is the noise we build on top of it, the carnival rebranded as progress. Schopenhauer's remedy was neither capitulation nor naive optimism. It was the cultivation of a disciplined gaze, a tragic wisdom that looks into the cyclone without blinking. He borrowed from the Buddhists' insight that craving is the axis of suffering, yet he rejected their promise of a salved world to come. Instead, he offered aesthetic contemplation as momentary anesthesia. Lose yourself in art, music, the sublime quiet of landscapes, and the will loosens its fist just long enough for you to feel the bones of your own being. When a symphony sweeps you past the limits of language, when brushstrokes turn canvas into thunder, the will is momentarily transfixed by its own reflection, and you lucky witness hover in a zone where desire is suspended. The pain returns, of course. The hydra regrows. But those intervals of beauty teach us that the prison walls have cracks through which moonlight leaks. They prove that consciousness, cursed though it is, can also be a lantern capable of igniting awe, even in dungeons. Yet art alone cannot shoulder the weight of existence. Eventually, the concert ends. The gallery lights flicker off. The mountain vista fades into night, and you must re-enter the marketplace of hungers. Here the question becomes, how will you suffer? Will you suffer passively, curled around the hurt like a clenched fist, or will you suffer actively, transforming discomfort into a lens that magnifies truth? Psychologists speak of meaning-making after trauma, the alchemy by which humans twist raw pain into stories that grant shape to chaos. Schopenhauer anticipated this. If we cannot annihilate pain, we can at least assign it a role in the narrative we are writing every second. The traveler might rename his bleeding footsteps as punctuation marks commas that slow him down, forcing him to notice the texture of the path. Semicolons that connect moments he once thought disconnected. The story grows denser, more muscular, precisely because it is weighted by authentic difficulty. Notice how this reframing differs from the cheap sheen of positivity that floods self-help aisles. It does not deny agony, it dignifies it. It says, your sleepless nights are not glitches to be debugged. They are proof of your membership in the human symphony. By feeling the bass lines of sorrow, you secure your part in the chorus that has been groaning since the first scream of childbirth echoed in a cave. And if that chorus seems dissonant, remember that some harmonies can only be heard when notes clash. The beauty lies not in erasing tension, but in orchestrating it. So breathe with the awareness that every inhale courts disappointment and every exhale releases attachment that was never yours to leash. As lungs rise and fall, so does the universe contracting and expanding inside your skull. Thoughts surge, hopes ignite, fears scorch, and all of it is stagecraft for a spectacle that will end the moment your neurons fall silent. Knowing this, the traveler walks again, not because hope has triumphed, but because the very act of movement is a refusal to let suffering dictate the final lines of the script. Remember, inevitability is not equivalent to domination. Rain is inevitable, yet it bends to the angles of an umbrella. It gathers in gutters where children make paper boats. Likewise, pain, relentless as gravity, can be steered into patterns that nourish solidarity, insight, even dark humor that hollows out despair's dominion. The will may be sovereign, but we are its court jesters, mocking the king with our stubborn creativity, surviving on laughter carved from the ribs of anguish. Picture now the hush that falls over a crowded commuter train the instant it shuts down between stations. Fluorescent lights flicker, fans die, and in that vacuum, every passenger feels exposed, stripped of momentum, forced to meet their own reflection in the black window. That frozen carriage is a microcosm of what Schopenhauer called the pendulum swing between pain and boredom. When striving stalls, desire mutates into agitation, a restless itch that searches for the next target. Some stare at dimmed phones as though willing the pixels back to life. Others avert their gaze, terrified that eye contact might reveal a shared helplessness. Yet within that suspended breath hides an invitation. If suffering is the baseline hum of existence, then moments of enforced stillness reveal the score beneath our frantic improvisations. The philosopher insists we listen, hear the subtle harmonics, heartbeats overlapping, shallow breaths sinking, the creak of metal holding us in reluctant fellowship. Psychologists call this spontaneous synchrony. Mystics label it the communal pulse. Schopenhauer would shrug and say it is the same will knotted into many nervous systems at once. And here lies an overlooked power. Though we cannot silence the will, we can align with its rhythm in each other, transmuting solitary anguish into collective resonance. The train shudders back to life and strangers resume scrolling. But for a fragment they existed as a single chord, their unease shared, diluted, reframed. This is not romantic delusion, it is neurological reality. Empathy lights up brain regions that blur the border between self and other, softening pain's edges by distributing it. In practical terms, when you confess your dread aloud, when your voice cracks and someone else nods with wet eyes, the burden shifts fractionally, becomes portable. Schopenhauer, sardonic as he was, recognized compassion as the lone ethical miracle in a hostile world. Suffering is inevitable, yet the choice to witness another's hurt is elective, rebellious. You validate their torment not by erasing it, but by refusing to abandon them inside it. The traveler, once alone on the ridge, now finds companions wounded, weary, but still climbing. And though each step remains laced with knives, the shared march echoes with grim music, percussion forged from boot soles striking stone in unison. Observe how this subverts consumer culture's gospel of individual optimization. Self-improvement peddlers preach escape from pain through personal upgrades, biohack your sleep, monetize your passion, manifest abundance. But if the engine of discontent is systemic, no tweak to the carburetor will halt the machine. What liberates is not a shinier self, but a wider circle. When the corporate ladder reveals itself as an infinite treadmill, turn sideways and extend a hand. If you must run, at least choreograph a dance. In this choreography, tragedy and creativity become partners. Viktor Frankl, survivor of camps Schopenhauer never dreamed imaginable, wrote that those who found meaning in suffering could endure the unendurable. Meaning, here, is not a sugary slogan. It is the bone-deep realization that agony can be forged into a tool, to carve art, to erect justice, to pierce complacency. The pain itself does not ennoble what you sculpt from it does. Think of kintsugi, the Japanese craft of mending broken pottery with lacquer mixed with gold. Cracks are not hidden, they are illuminated, testified to. So too with psychic fractures. They glitter when we pour luminous attention into them, when we say, here is where I was shattered, and here is where I chose to illuminate the fault line instead of pretending it never happened. Schopenhauer might scoff at the metaphor's prettiness, yet even he conceded that recognition of universal suffering dissolves petty egotism. Your cracks are my cracks. Fill them with gold and the light spills across both of us. This does not negate the biological thud of grief when the phone rings at midnight or the sterile sting of a hospital corridor. Nothing negates it. But it can be transfigured into narrative gold, the alloy of memory, and meaning that future minds will hold up to candlelight and whisper, I'm less alone because someone bled this story into existence. Art becomes shared scar tissue, philosophy the suture thread, Psychology, the antiseptic honesty that keeps infection of denial at bay. Carry this framework back to the storm of everyday irritations, the traffic jam, the rejected manuscript, the anxious spiral at 2 a.m. When frustration swells, remind yourself, I am feeling the pulse of the will, so is everyone else caught in this snarl of red taillights. We are a chorus of thwarted intentions, and in that we are kin. Let the kinship soften the edge. Let it turn clenched teeth into a half-smile of recognition. Yes, the Hydra will roar anew, yet every time you greet it with communal instead of private dread, one of its heads hesitates confused, disarmed by solidarity. That hesitation is space, and space is possibility. Stretch it wide enough and you can breathe inside the beast. Now imagine the summit itself, a ragged plateau where clouds knot into dark fists and the air tastes of iron, where every instinct begs you to crawl backward into easier altitudes. Lightning forks across the horizon like a surgeon's scalpel, revealing for one blinding instant the scarred geography of your journey. The first bewildered steps, the slips, the blood, the borrowed courage of companions, the nights when frost clung to your ribs like chain mail. You stand barefoot, heartbeat battering your ribs, and finally see what the climb has always been toward. Not a palace, not a revelation that erases sorrow, but a mirror built of storm water pooled in a hollow of rock. Schopenhauer would say the mirror shows the will reflected pure, stripped of disguises. Lean closer, and you meet your own eyes, dilated, ungovernable, fierce. The wind howls, white noise of existence, and for a moment, the boundary between inner and outer ruptures. You understand deeper than any theory that the ravine of suffering has carved the very shape of your soul. Remove it, and you erase the contours that make you legible to yourself. The pain was never an intruder, it was the chisel, and you were the marble. This realization does not anesthetize the ache in your calves or the sting of old wounds reopening in the cold. It does something subtler yet more radical. It detangles agony from shame. Suffering remains inevitable, but the story that it is evidence of failure dissolves. Here, on this wind-lashed altar, failure becomes a myth because success was never the metric persistence was. Each throb in your muscles, each scar, is notarized proof that you answered life's summons even when the summons was a scream. And now a different sound threads through the gale. A low, resonant hum rising from the gorge below. Thousands of voices entwined a hymn of all beings who have ever hurt and kept breathing. You recognize chords of ancient lullabies, wartime laments, whispered prayers at bedside vigils, protest chants echoing off tear-gassed streets. They converge into one vast vibration that shudders through bone and granite alike. You add your voice, cracked yet unbroken, and the pitch shifts, becoming fractionally richer. That is the quiet power Schopenhauer hinted at but could not fully name. When consciousness confronts the inevitability of pain and still chooses affirmation, it manufactures a defiance that outlives any single body. The will may grind on, indifferent, but within its gears sparks are struck moments of lucid solidarity that flare against the dark like fireflies signaling to one another across summer fields. The flames will die, the field will turn to winter, yet each spark is a data point in the cosmic ledger that declares, we were here, we knew the price, we paid it in full, and we sang anyway. Turn from the mirror and look outward. The path down is steeper, slipperier, mapped with fresh perils, yet your posture has changed. You no longer stagger under the illusion that peace waits at some mythical finish line. You carry peace ember bright in the pocket of awareness that suffering is woven into every breath, and therefore cannot rob meaning, it can only refine it. In descending, you become mentor to those still thrashing in the foothills, not with platitudes, but with the raw testimony of lived proof. That despair can be survived, that wounds can glow, that the will's dominion is absolute, yet not exhaustive, because consciousness can meet it with an artistry of endurance. And should the Hydra strike again, and its teeth will find a spirit tempered like Damascus steel, folded 1,000 times in the furnace of inevitable hurt. When night clamps down and vision shrinks to the radius of a single heartbeat, Remember this summit-born clarity. Pain's permanence is not your prison. It is the terrain where your stance becomes meaningful. Stand then. Let the wind stampede through you without toppling the scaffolding of your resolve. Feel the whole orchestra of existence surge, cells regenerating, planets colliding, strangers somewhere laughing themselves breathless, oceans tearing themselves open against moonlit cliffs. All of it thrums inside your chest like a second heart. Suffering is inevitable, yes, but so is this pulse, this capacity to witness, to shape, to revolt by creating beauty sharper than misery's edge. And when dawn claws up from behind distant crags, you will walk into its bruised gold, knowing the torment of existential suffering is not merely endured, it is employed, transmuted, weaponized into compassion and art and ferocious tenderness for every trembling creature on the trail. This is the inheritance Schopenhauer left smoldering on the page, and you are its living continuation. A being aflame with lucid grief, refusing to dim, marching onward with eyes wide, slicing darkness open with the radiant knife of consciousness.